Good evening, everybody. I'm so happy to be here with you all tonight, and I'm honored to be here and happy to have a wonderful group of expert panelists along with me. But I am here to talk about the basics of sexuality education. So tonight, we're going to talk about some basic objectives. I know that the audience is largely made up of parents and family members. I assume there are also some professionals in the audience, and also I understand there may be some self-advocates in the audience. And so I'm really excited to have such a diverse group of people tonight. And I welcome your questions. I can promise you I won't have all the answers, but we certainly want to hear your questions and concerns as we go. This is a mammoth topic of sexuality education. And when in developing this material, I just wanted to let you all know that I obtained direct input and consultation from self-advocates, parents and caregivers, and other professionals on this webinar development. And as we all know, and as they all conveyed as well, this webinar is not just about puberty. This webinar is not actually about sexual intercourse or reproduction necessarily at all. This topic completely intersects with fundamental areas of self-advocacy and safety and social skills and social thinking. And it can be overwhelming to consider all of this. I know this. So as we move through this webinar tonight, I would encourage you all, please, don't try to do it all. Don't try to, take it all in necessarily. I think that's impossible. But as we move through this webinar, there are just 4 things I hope that you can try to keep in mind. First, to be proactive wherever you can, to be concrete and clear when you're supporting individuals with autism around this topic, this content, these concepts that are related to sexuality education, to use visual supports to support understanding. And fourth, just to pick one place to start. Start just in one small place and don't try to tackle everything. That's the starting point here. So my goal is just to briefly touch on the core features of autism as they relate to this topic, because if we understand autism as caregivers and as professionals, it can help to inform the way we approach this topic. It should inform how we address the topic of sexuality education, trying to provide support and education through the lens of autism. I also want to identify just some key areas of focus within this topic, some of the topics that typically come up, things that we might need to proactively try to address, and then identify some of the best practices and the resources. There are so many, there's luckily a growing body of resources out there on teaching skills and concepts related to sexuality. So that's good to know. And so I'm going to point you to some of those resources that are online, free resources, and also commercially available curricula and other publications that are out there. So as we approach this topic, as I was developing this content, it's important to consider some of the general best practices in sexuality education. So first and foremost, it's important for us as adults, as caregivers, as parents, to educate ourselves. And I know this is a touchy topic. This is not an easy topic to address. And I know that we have many different levels of comfort in talking about these topics with other people, with our children. But it's important that we try to work to be knowledgeable and comfortable about the basics and to understand the basic primary terminology that will help explain the basics to others, and to be comfortable, more and more comfortable using this terminology ourselves. It's also critical that when we consider the broad topic of sexuality education, that we first and foremost are not talking about sexual intercourse. Sexuality education starts far before that would ever be a consideration or a factor for some. And lots of us, including, I can remember as a teenager, I had a very awkward conversation with my dad. My dad kind of grabbed me one day and just decided to have the talk. And I know lots of us have had those very uncomfortable one-and-dones with our parents back in the day where the talk was about sexual intercourse or reproduction or protection. But by the time those conversations occur, many have already heard lots about sex from their peers, unfortunately. And in many cases, parents and caregivers are late to the game in those conversations. On the other hand, though, and I feel this way as a parent of 3 boys, I know that these talks are so much more comfortable. Addressing these issues and concepts is so much easier when it's conducted at a young age, an early age, when questions would naturally arise with young children. And then the aim is to try to keep that conversation door open and take natural opportunities to continue the dialogue over time as the issues become more complex. So I'm framing this because I'm basing this talk, at least to start, on best practices generally in sexuality education that it should inform our response. And it's important to, that on these ongoing early and age developmentally appropriate dialogue should happen as much as we can make that happen. And I realize we're talking about the autism population. So sometimes the dialogue is going to look very different. The instruction is going to look different. But to the extent possible, early, age appropriate, developmentally appropriate, and rather than any kind of one and done, when they're turned 13, then we're going to address it. Experts in sexuality education and pediatrics would say it's much more effective if we can start early and just keep that dialogue going. And of course, keeping it simple and presenting information in stages is a strong recommendation by many experts, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, so that we're not just having to address a topic in full all in one point, but rather just taking it one little baby step at a time is definitely a strong recommendation. So I'm framing it with these basic principles in mind. And then on top of this, of course, we have to think about the autism population. And as professionals, of course, are working with families, for those of you all who are professionals out there in the audience, maybe we must be sensitive to the experiences and the values and beliefs that in part comprise cultural identity and have a huge influence on how the broad topic of sexuality education is viewed by the families and individuals who we support. And so I want to be sensitive, and we all have to be sensitive and responsive to that we are all going to have diverse values and beliefs around this topic in some cases. So a key point here is that sexuality is a part of every individual's life, including individuals with disabilities. And for decades, and I'm sure many of you know this, that historically, people with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities have in some cases been thought to be asexual historically, or eternal children, so to speak, having no need for loving or fulfilling relationships with others. That's one misconception that's held true still to today in some cases. Furthermore, people with intellectual or developmental disabilities frequently lack access to appropriate sex education in schools and other settings. And at the same time, some individuals engage in sexual activity as a result of poor options or manipulation or loneliness, or in some cases, physical force, rather than as an expression of their sexuality. And so it's just important, a fundamental premise is that sexuality, everyone is a sexual being. It's just, the idea is that we're not necessarily always talking about sexual intercourse when we say that. But sexuality education is a continuum that starts very early and progresses over time. And unfortunately, within the autism population, we know that any type of disability appears to continue to contribute to a higher risk of being victimized. So individuals with autism are at greater risk for victimization. We know that individuals are also at greater risk for sexual abuse, for example. So a study of approximately 55,000 children in Nebraska found that children with intellectual disabilities and or autism were at least 4 times more likely than children without disabilities to be sexually abused. The Justice Department released data recently that shows that people with intellectual disabilities or people with autism, for example, are the victims of sexual assault at rates more than 7 times those people without disabilities. And so I'm saying all this because fundamental to this webinar that I'm giving is the idea that we have to promote self-advocacy in all of its forms. Because in doing so, that's a key effort towards keeping individuals safe. And in part by empowering people with knowledge and skills and self-advocacy skills, it can help protect them from victimization in some cases. And so it's really critical that we think about it as in that regard as well. And so these are just a couple quick, quotes that we know that, sexuality ed should be proactive, as most learners with a developmental disability receive sexuality education only after having engaged in sexual behavior, for example, that is considered inappropriate or offensive or potentially dangerous. oftentimes what happens is we bring issues, or I'll have families come and when they're already in crisis, or when there's already a significant problem that's emerged. And so we're kind of reacting and putting out fires rather than being able to be a little bit more proactive in our support, in our education, in the promotion of self-advocacy and other behaviors and skills that relate to sexuality education. And so it's just important that we think about this as being proactive as we possibly can. And so in addition to our recognition that general best practices in sexuality education must guide or inform how we approach this topic, obviously, our understanding of autism, core features, also must inform our response. And so I just wanted to spend a couple quick moments. And I think many of you all are experts on autism because you have children or adult children with autism yourselves, or maybe you are an individual with autism on this webinar. And obviously you have greater expertise than I do in that experience. But I wanted to just touch on the core features of autism for anyone maybe in the audience who doesn't have that background or knowledge, because without that understanding of autism, often we are finding that sexuality education is insufficient. It's not hitting the mark. It's not responsive to the autism. So we need to understand some of those autism core features that will inform how we address this topic. And so one core feature of autism that we know to be the case with many is that some individuals have difficulty generalizing skills or ideas learned under one condition to other situations. And so some with autism may appear to display specific interests in parts of objects or situations. So they focus on the details, but may struggle to see the big picture, or to connect, to see the forest and distinguish the forest from the trees. And they're only seeing the trees, for example. And so a good example of this is, in terms of thinking about how some individuals with autism may struggle to generalize concepts. I was working with a young man in the high school setting when I was a high school teacher. And we were working on the concept of personal space, personal boundaries, staying out of other people's personal bubble. And he was doing a really nice job of understanding that you need to stay, arm's length apart from other people when you're interacting with them and not entering their physical space. And so he understood that rule in particular situations. And then we had to work on generalizing that rule to other situations that are relevant. Like if somebody is sitting at a table and there are a bunch of empty chairs and you don't know the other people at that table well, you wouldn't sit right next to those people. You're going to sit a few spaces apart from them. So the concept of personal space has to be taught explicitly and generalized. We have to work on explicitly teaching the ways in which that concept or skill or rule applies in other situations. But what I discovered, and I only found this out through an administrator who came to me one day and said, "Hey, Ms. Southern, I think you need to also maybe address with this student the issue of personal space as it relates to using the bathrooms." And obviously that wasn't something I was going to be able to address. So we had to have another male teacher talk to this student and help him to understand the rules that govern how a guy chooses a urinal. So if a guy is at a urinal, do you go to the one right next to him? Apparently the rule among you all men who would know this is the answer is no. You would choose a few spaces down. But this individual with autism didn't understand that rule, wasn't following that rule because he didn't see how it connected to the concept of personal space that we had taught in other situations. So my point here is that sometimes when we teach rules or concepts that might be related in some way to sexuality education, that we're going to have to be pretty intentional and clear and concrete about the ways in which those rules generalize to other situations and how they're connected to other situations to help those individuals to be more successful. We also know that some individuals may struggle with the nuances or the hidden messages that other people send and receive when they interact. Abstract social concepts, abstract social information, maybe taking some information very literally and concretely. Some with autism may struggle to assume the perspective of another or see another point of view of another person, and may struggle to put themselves in someone else's shoes. And this could cause somebody with autism to maybe misunderstand another person's message or the intent of their message. Or one might struggle to know how someone else is thinking or feeling in a given situation, or what they're planning or what their intent is. And as you can imagine, that has huge implications for interpersonal and social relationships with others. Some may struggle with the concept that we think about each other as we're interacting with each other, and that our thoughts about people change based on their behavior. So imagine how this, of course, complicates the already supremely complicated world, for example, of preteen and teen relationships and social interactions. So one key idea here is that some individuals with autism may struggle with to understand the hidden curriculum, or that there even is a whole world of hidden rules that govern how we behave and socially interact with one another. So the hidden curriculum is made up of all those social guidelines that everyone knows, but no one is directly, or many aren't directly or explicitly taught. And it involves observational learning, where many of us might pick up on what's accepted versus what's unacceptable simply by watching and learning, by observing facial expressions, reactions, or outcomes of social behavior. And we know that many with autism may struggle to use those observational skills to learn what the rules are. And so, for example, the hidden rules of like, I shouldn't have to tell you, but this is a private behavior. This is a private topic. We don't talk about this with some people. Or you should only do these private behaviors in your own bathroom or in your own bedroom. In some cases, for some individuals with autism, unless we explicitly address those rules and concepts, the individual may not just know those to be true. Or it should be obvious, quote unquote, for example, that we don't ask strangers or coworkers particular questions. There are some topics and questions that are just off limits. But unless we explicitly teach some with autism those rules, they may not follow those rules. So there's this whole hidden world of social rules that for some with autism, we have to be very explicit and clear about in terms of unpacking and clarifying what the rules are. And this has huge implications for sexuality education, which we're going to get to in a moment. You know, a sort of another example of a hidden rule is that, you know, in some cases, some individuals with autism have told me that they've been taught to, you know, make eye contact or, you know, to kind of look somebody in the eye. But then what didn't get addressed, and I was talking to a young man where this was the case, where he wasn't explicitly taught the nuances of eye contact, that if you stare too long, if you look too long, it looks like staring. And then it's interpreted as creepy or weird or unusual. So there's all these nuances that for some with autism, we have to be very explicit in helping them to recognize and understand. And so it's just one example. Again, just kind of I'm moving very quickly through the core features of autism. I've talked a little bit about social perspective taking and understanding the hidden rules, talked about the problems that some individuals with autism have in generalizing concepts skilled under one condition to other conditions. Another thing we know about many individuals with autism is that they may exhibit restricted areas of focus, you know, topics of interest or areas that are, you know, specifically very motivating or reinforcing to them. And so, or there may be sensory regulation differences. And there's a clear connection between some of those differences that we see and some of the issues that might come up as they relate to sexuality education. We also know that some with autism may struggle to control impulses or to stop and think before they're acting. Or some may struggle to stop and consider the implications or the social implications of their behavior. And so it's just important to recognize that for some, this is certainly not true of all individuals with autism, but for some, there are some issues that we have to address around impulsivity or difficulty with planning and foreseeing the consequences of our own behavior. And of course, this is really critical. This is a critical core feature that has a lot of relevance to the topic of sexuality education. It's important to note that many with autism struggle to initiate communication and to self-advocate in a variety of situations. And of course, there are some with autism who may have very limited ways to convey basic wants and needs, like where they want to go or what they want to eat. Others may be other individuals with autism, of course, are conversational in their language, but they still may struggle to initiate communication and to self-advocate in certain situations, particularly in socially demanding situations that are complex and overwhelming for some. And central to this issue of sexuality education and self-advocacy is the idea that everyone on the spectrum deserves and needs a way to say what they want and what they do not want, to be able to assent and to dissent. And when we think about sexuality education, some of the key underpinnings of self-advocacy and self-esteem and having a strong self-concept and an empowered voice in whatever form that voice comes That's critical. So my point here is that long before we're even thinking about addressing the topic of sexuality education, we have to be thinking about the fundamentals of self-advocacy across the spectrum and across the lifespan from age 1, age 99. And so we know that this is so critical that many individuals with autism struggle to self-advocate regardless of where they fall on the spectrum. So before we even launch into these little vignettes, and what I'm about to show you are a series of examples, little stories, little case studies that presents particular individuals with autism and particular issues, if you want to call them issues, that that are presenting to themselves, to families, and to the professionals who are supporting them. But I just want to make it clear that sexuality education starts long before puberty, and it starts in these 3 core areas of self-advocacy in all of its forms, social skills and social understanding, and healthy relationships. These are pivotal to and fundamental to sexuality education. And so if you think about self-advocacy, I'm thinking about a 2-year-old with whom I'm working with who has autism. I want him to be able to say what he wants and what he doesn't want, to be able to protest appropriately and safely and have a voice to say no, because that matters. It matters for a lot of reasons, and it has real relevance when we get down the road to sexuality education. Him being able to advocate for what he wants and what he doesn't want, and him being able to recognize what are healthy relationships comprised of and what are they not. And obviously the fundamentals of social skills and social understanding have a lot of intersection to this topic. So these are some of the major areas. These are like topics, curriculum topics, basic big concepts that we find when we're addressing sexuality education that we iteratively or have to repeatedly come back to and address across the developmental continuum, or as the individual gets older and older and as they age and develop. These are areas that we often have to address, but they start very early. And from a developmental perspective, like the American Academy of Pediatrics, of course, would say that for a young child, it's important that they be able to identify their own body parts and use specific and accurate terminology around those body parts. So using terms like penis and vagina rather than sort of nicknames, and being very technical and clear. The idea that our body is our own. That's a critical, important concept that we want to teach. We try to teach very young children from a very early point. This is my body, it's my own body. And also helping them to understand the rules that govern the other people's personal space and physical contact, and addressing that from a very early point. So if you look at this list, the origin of babies, reproduction, it's not necessarily that you're going to hit all of these topics all at once. That is not the point. My point is that maybe this list offers you a starting point, an entry point, a place in, because you're all are supporting and loving different people with autism along the continuum and at different age points. And so thinking about where's the starting point for this particular person who you're supporting is going to be very different depending on who they are. Private versus public behaviors might be the topic that you then have to address using strategies, which I will present. Internet safety is a big one that comes up and has a lot of intersection with the topic of sexuality education. Understanding the prerequisite steps to a personal relationship. What does it mean to be a friend? How do you know when somebody is a friend to you and when they're not? Helping some individuals with autism to recognize the signs, the clues, the cues that would help them to know if they are being treated well or being mistreated by a friend. These are core prerequisite skills that for some we have to teach far before we're ever thinking about talking about sex. So the list goes on and on, but I hope that this is just a helpful sort of mini curricula that sort of lists some of the major topics, major issues that we often see that we need to address. And it's going to look different depending on who the individual is and how old they are and where they are from a developmental perspective. So again, as some basic intervention guidelines, no matter who the individual is, as much as you can, trying to be proactive to start as early as you can. to get ahead of it before there's a problem, to be very concrete and very clear. And one way we do that is by using visual supports. And I'm going to show you a variety of examples of those. Using visual supports to support instruction, to promote understanding of and adherence to the rules that govern certain behaviors, and to help break down complex concepts. We have to use visual supports to do this. And then teaching, and in many cases, when there's a problem that's presenting itself, the idea is if there is a problem we're seeing, what are we going to support that individual in doing instead of what the behavior is that they're displaying? What are we going to teach and reinforce as an alternative, as a safe, healthy alternative? So these are 4 key intervention guidelines that I hope you'll see run through each of the case studies that I'm about to show you. So the first example, Devin, and this is obviously not a real person, but Devin is a 6-year-old boy with basic functional language who is served in a kindergarten through 2nd grade classroom for students with autism. And at times, he seeks out social attention and sensory input by sitting on people's laps, laying his head on people's laps, seeking big, deep pressure hugs. And he does this with family members, but also with teachers, parents, friends, and neighbors, and other less familiar people. In a few recent episodes, he has approached total strangers and sought out these hugs. So he's 6. And so I think in some cases, who would think we're talking about sexuality education right now? But we are. We are, because we're thinking about the ideas that we want to keep Devin safe. We want to keep Devin safe and help him to understand the rules that govern who he should get close to physically and who he should not, to protect himself. And also, as he gets older, to protect him from getting in trouble or protect him from having his behavior be misinterpreted by others. So it starts, this is my point with this one example, it starts early. It starts way before we're ever really thinking and talking about puberty or sex. So what do? As we think about Devin, we need to think about how the core features of his autism are going to inform how we might intervene and support him in this situation. We can see that he is seeking out lots of social interaction. He wants to interact with people. He desires social interaction. That's a good thing. But he doesn't always know how to do it in the way that might be socially expected. And he seeks out sensory input. So he clearly is needing some sensory input, deep pressure from other people. And he has limited basic language. So he doesn't have a conversational language to be able to communicate and convey to others. So these are some of the core features we need to keep in mind. They're going to help us know how to intervene and how to support him. And he's also 6 years old, right? So here is a list of and I'm going to go through these sort of one by one, but this is for Devin. This is like a little mini intervention plan. By no means does this cover everything probably, but these are some of the key things that we need to take into account as we're deciding how to support Devin and how to address these behaviors that we're seeing. And I want to say right out of the gate that I don't know how I did this, but I accidentally deleted the most important strategy, one of the most important strategies from this list. And it is that we need to be collaborating with maybe an occupational therapist around those sensory needs that he clearly has. He's seeking pressure from others. He wants the touch. He's seeking deep pressure. So it's important for us to make sure that we are taking into account those sensory regulation needs. And so I'm sorry I left that off the list, but that's an important strategy to keep in mind here. But here are some of the other strategies as well. We want to support Devin in being able to label his own body parts with using accurate, clear terminology. There are important reasons why that's a critical self-advocacy skill. We want to help develop a simple, concrete social narrative that explains the rules. So I'm going to go through these strategies one by one and show you and try to illustrate how we might address these. But this is the list. And so here we go. So we're going to start with, of course, making sure that in supporting Devin and learning the names of body parts and teaching him the context and how to use those words appropriately. And then we're going to develop maybe a simple social story or social narrative to help him begin to understand the rules. And so here are 2 examples. This first example is a longer social narrative, and it says, I like getting hugs. I also like snuggles. Hugs and snuggles feel good to me. Hugs and snuggles are okay to do with some people. I can hug my mom. I can hug my dad. I can hug my brother. I can hug grandma and grandpa. These people are in my family. I can hug and snuggle people in my family. So this is where we're presenting a little story to help Devin understand the rules of who we can hug and listing it in a concrete manner. And for many individuals with autism, including Devin, given his age and given his autism, we would certainly want to include pictures, photos, Google images to help support his understanding as we are reading and reviewing this little social narrative with him. The social narrative is intended to explain the rules in a way that this particular individual can understand them. But here's page 2 of the social story or social narrative. Other people are not in my family. My teachers and neighbors are not in my family. Strangers are not in my family. I cannot hug and snuggle people who are not in my family. Instead, I can give them high fives. Hugs and snuggles are only for people in my family, and I will try to follow the hugs and snuggles rules. So this is a story that we write and that you individually tailor and design for the specific individual who you're supporting. It's not going to fix the issue all by itself, but it's one of the first steps we might use to help just present the information in a way that Devin might be able to understand it visually, concretely, with pictures embedded, photos of the people in his family, and then photos maybe of his teachers to help him understand who's on the hug list and who's on the high five list. And then we're reviewing this social narrative with Devin over and over again at key points to help the concepts to stick. So this is one key visual strategy. And then in some cases, maybe we need to try to use a visual reminder cue. So this is a simple rule card or other visual support before he encounters people in the community. So you have the social story, but then maybe what we need to do is develop a very quick reminder, a visual reminder that we can show to Devin. Maybe we show it to him before school each morning. Maybe we show him before we walk into Target or Walmart, where he's also starting to engage strangers in a way that is unexpected and not safe. And so here's the visual for him that we're showing him and just reminding him, hey, Devin, hugs are only for family. Hugs and high fives, and high fives are at school. These are Devin's rules. And we're not just saying it, we're showing it. There are a lot of examples, and I'm sure you all are aware of this. There are a lot of examples of social narratives out there, examples that get at some issue related to the idea of my body is my own, my body is private, the concepts of personal space. These are just a few examples of links, hyperlinks to some of those, but there's a lot of examples out there. And so I just wanted to provide you with a few. But sometimes a social narrative can be a good way to introduce an idea and then using it.
Louise, I don't know if this is an opportunity to make the question.
Please do. Yeah.
My son is 8 years old. He does not know how to bath himself, and I have always bathed him since he was a baby. But lately, few months ago, he does not want me to bath him, and he wants to be alone. And I'm concerned because he doesn't know how to take the water and dry himself. A couple weeks ago, I went to the bathroom to help him to bath, and I saw him that he was playing with his private part, and him start to crying and tell me, go away, go away.
Mm-hmm.
Now he doesn't want to be with me. He doesn't want to eat in the table. He wants to be in his bedroom. What should I do to educate him?
I think that's a great question. So I'll answer it a little bit. And then at the end, I think I'd like to get back to that more. So I think my initial response is, and obviously I don't know the child, so I don't know his level of understanding, but I think it might be really helpful maybe to explain to him. And again, this comes down to your values as a parent too. So I don't want to put my values onto you as a parent, whoever asked this question, but I guess if it were my child, what I would probably do is explain to him that it is okay for him to play with himself and use whatever language makes sense for him and for you in private settings, in his own bathroom. in his own bedroom, that it's okay, that there's nothing to be ashamed of about that, that it's okay. As long, and then so you're clarifying where it can happen and that it's okay and that it's normal. I think maybe normalizing it. The way you explain it is going to be so dependent on your child. And I would say you might write a little social, I know it might sound strange, but this is a perfect example of maybe where you write a little social story about what it's, that it's okay to do that, to have private time, and maybe giving it a name like private time or whatever makes sense for you. And then clarifying, here are the places where it can happen and that it's okay. That's my answer for now, for the first part of it. And we can talk more about some of the other aspects of it a little bit later. But that's the first piece I would say. And that's a really good question. So this is a social narrative example too. This is one where I wrote this for a specific child who loves outer space themes. He's all about outer space, loves all things astronauts and space, all that. So I used his very special topic of interest that he likes to talk about and he's very motivated by. And I wrote a social narrative for him that tried to get buy-in. What I was trying to do is to describe the rules of personal space while also using themes that he cares about to help him understand and to buy in to the theme, or to the rule, I mean. So this example says Captain Moonbeamer's rocket ship is very small and it is hard not to get close to people sometimes, but he always tries to follow the personal space rules and not be a space invader. He will stay at least 1 arm's length away from other people. This makes all astronauts happy. He wants Devin to always try to do this too. So there's a lot of different ways. I'm just giving you examples of ways to use social narratives and visual supports to help explain the rules of what's expected when it comes to the issue of personal space and boundaries. So some of the other strategies that I want to touch on is obviously Devin wants to interact with people. He wants to interact with teachers. He wants to interact with people in the community. So we need to give him a different way to interact than by hugging or trying to sit on people's laps, because obviously, that's not safe for him to do that. And so we want to teach him alternative ways to get those same needs met. And so let me show you some examples of that. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. Jumping ahead. So for example, and then practicing that. So if we're out in the community and he wants to say hello, modeling, prompting him, using guidance to support him in saying hello or giving a wave or giving a handshake or a high five, and getting ahead of it. So we're reminding him of what he can do instead in that moment, right before he interacts with other people. And we're teaching him the alternative behavior. We're showing him what to do instead. Because what we don't want to do to Devin is just say, stop, don't do that. Don't sit in people's laps. Don't go hug that stranger. Instead, it's often more effective if we say what he should do. What can he do instead of that? How can he interact with those people in a way that's more appropriate and safe? And this involves a lot of repeated practice and modeling and using positive strategies, lots of praise, lots of reinforcement along the way. Oh, I like how you did that. You did so awesome. That was a great way to say hello to her. And then if he does, let's say you're out in the community, or he's in the school setting and he starts to go and sit in a teacher's lap. It's important for everybody who's supporting him to be non-emotional when they are interrupting that, so that we don't add fuel to it or to show that we're upset by it or anything like that, but rather just to calmly and neutrally redirect him and say, oh, let's give a high five instead. Hi. And so we're giving him something else he can do instead, and we're not negatively reacting to the behavior itself. So these are just some, yeah.
This is Kim. It reminds me, my son had more challenges around this in his communication, and to expect that some of our children or our loved ones are going to be able to remember what they can do in one setting, but not in another setting, can also be difficult. For example, if my son Trevor wasn't, supposed to kind of keep that bubble of safety on who was allowed to hug him, he wouldn't know that he can hug grandma, but he shouldn't be hugging somebody out in the community. Do you have some suggestions to, I know what we ended up doing, but I didn't know if you wanted to mention that here, that sometimes that generalization across different places that you're at is very difficult for our kids to do.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'd love to hear what you did, Kim. I think that, I think that's important. I mean, I think that comes back to trying to use concrete visual supports that delineate, that clarify who we can engage in that closer physical contact with and who we cannot. And I think where the lines get blurred are particularly when we're thinking about younger children, where, sure, like obviously it makes sense that a 6-year-old child might want to climb on a teacher's lap or climb on a clinician or therapist's lap. But if those boundaries are really blurry for that child, we're going to have to kind of unblur those pretty fast and be very clear and sort of black and white in the rules very early on so that there aren't problems later. But I'm not sure I'm answering what you're saying, Kim. So, I mean, what did you do in your case?
Well, it was more of just touch on that, a bit. For us, we did create like a book that had pictures of who it was okay for him to hug. So it had the pictures, and we made sure that we were reviewing those. There's a really great comment, Louise, as well, that you can weave this in. Somebody did ask if there'll be any discussion around some non-binary identification as well. So you may want to touch on some of that also throughout your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, there's a lot of topics that are really complex that go beyond the scope of what we can do in this basic introductory webinar. And so I want to be respectful of that for sure. And acknowledge, that obviously that's a critical topic and a critical consideration. And I know a lot of individuals our families and others are coming and presenting questions about how to support an individual in those contexts. And so I think that for this webinar, we're going to keep it pretty basic. But I think it's a really important topic that I know is relevant for a lot of people. So I appreciate that. In an hour and a half webinar, we want to keep things basic at this point, just in terms of what we're trying to address. So another case example this is Kevin. He's a 12-year-old boy with no vocal language who has served in a classroom for students with autism. And in recent months, he has started masturbating in public contexts. So on bus rides, classroom, home, common areas. And this started out in pre-adolescence earlier on as like kind of groin pressing or rubbing up against pillows or furniture. Kevin tends to engage in these behaviors to, of course, obtain input because it feels good. Anecdotal reports and direct observation suggest that Kevin is more likely to engage in this behavior during downtime leisure activities when otherwise unengaged. So when he's just kind of hanging out, or in generally less structured periods or unstructured time. So we're figuring out that this is when Kevin might tend to engage in this behavior. He doesn't have vocal language. And he clearly is engaging in this behavior because it feels good, right? And so we're thinking about those core features of autism that should inform how we respond in this context. And so for Kevin, this specific example, this is the set of strategies. These are some of the core considerations to take into account. And from my perspective, and again, this is where different values of families are going to be relevant and come into play. But from my perspective, when this issue has come up and families have brought this issue to us to support them in addressing, it's my opinion, obviously, that we want to make sure Kevin has the opportunity and he has the right to engage in private time. It's a matter then of supporting him in better understanding where and when that can happen to keep him safe, of course. And so this is the set of strategies. I'm going to talk through these. So one key strategy to consider here is when Kevin does engage in this and starts to engage in masturbation in a public context, or maybe in the home setting to start, one idea can be to pair that with a private time visual cue. So a picture that depicts what private time is, with opportunities to engage in it. And what I mean by that is that if Kevin's at home and he's starting to engage in that behavior of masturbation when he's sitting out in the living room, for example, that's not the setting maybe in which the family would like for that to occur, then in that moment, if it's possible to redirect Kevin to his room and to show him that visual of private time and try to teach him by showing it repeatedly in that situation where you're guiding him and directing him to his room, this is where you can engage in it. This is where you can have private time. And you're showing him what that visual means as you're guiding him. And the reason to do that is so you can teach what that visual cue represents, so that over time, hopefully, it might acquire meaning and value for him. And the reason maybe for Kevin, given that he has no vocal language, he doesn't have a way to vocalize the need for private time. He needs another way to express that need. And he also might need a way to visually see, for example, even on his visual schedule, when and where is he going to be able to engage in it? And so I was working with an individual who was engaging in these behaviors in the school setting. And it was important for him to understand that obviously he wasn't going to be able to engage in it at school, but when could he have private time? And the way to signal that or communicate that to Kevin was by using a visual schedule to clarify when can it occur. And so this, as you can see here on the right, this is just one example of a picture schedule. It shows kind of what's going to happen and in what order across somebody's afternoon, for example, or in their morning. And so for some individuals with autism, it can be important to actually place the private time visual on their schedule so that it's clear when it is available to them. That's an important, it comes back to self-advocacy. Everybody deserves the right for private time if they want that. And so it's a matter of helping them to understand when and where it can happen and having a way to self-advocate around it and understand when it's going to occur. And so in some cases, that can help to place some boundaries around private time. Private time can happen in my bedroom, or private time can happen in my own bathroom, and clarifying that rule for Kevin. So here's one example of a very modified visual rule card. And this is just one example. This isn't going to work for everyone. This is just one example that was relevant for this particular case, where we're displaying, after school, I can have private time in my bedroom, hands and pants only in my bathroom or in my bedroom. And so we're defining what the rules are and where this behavior can and should occur, rather than saying, don't do it. This is what you cannot do. We're trying to signal and clarify visually and concretely where it can happen. So this comes back to using visuals and being concrete and clear in the use of those. Devin, given that he has no vocal language, he needs another way to self-advocate around all of his wants and needs. And certainly for Kevin, it may be very important for us to also consider supporting him in requesting and being able to communicate, I would like to go have private time, and signaling that and being able to convey that. And so whatever augmentative tool, for example, Kevin is using, this might be an important message that we need to program and teach him to be able to say. Again, it comes back to self-advocacy. It's so important for individuals, of course, to be able to have all the rights that anyone else has. And so it's important for them to be able to self-advocate around this right as well. And so giving him a way to say it and giving him the opportunity and clarifying on his visual schedule, for example, where and when it can occur. These are key strategies that might prevent some of the problems that we're otherwise seeing with Kevin, where he's displaying this behavior in public settings where it shouldn't happen. It may be really important for Kevin, given that, for example, he sometimes is engaging in this behavior on the school bus, for example, or in his cab, in places where it can't occur. We might need to consider what are some of the other activities and materials that we can give to Kevin while he's on the school bus to keep him busy, to keep him engaged, to keep him distracted, so that he's less likely to engage in masturbation on the school bus. And so, for example, this is another sort of visual narrative that displays for Kevin on the bus. I can play with my iPad. I can hold my Pokemon cards. I can squeeze my putty. So it's a visual cue reminding Kevin in concrete picture form of what he can do on the school bus. Here are the things you can do. And then in some cases, it might involve giving Kevin materials, giving him, a small box of supplies or materials that just keeps him engaged while he's on the bus. It may prevent some of the problem behavior that we're otherwise seeing if he has something else to do instead. And then another primary strategy, of course, and I know this is easier said than done, and we certainly work with a lot of professionals such as teachers and school settings around this issue of non-emotionally interrupting and redirecting. So, for example, if Kevin does start to put his hands down his pants in the classroom, I understand that the impulse of adults in the room might be say like, no, stop, don't do that. But in doing so, sometimes this can add more fuel to it. It can provide a lot more attention to the behavior. And those strong negative reactions sometimes are not helpful in these situations. So rather, being calm and non-emotional and neutral in our response, and just trying to naturally and quickly redirect him to whatever it is he's supposed to be doing instead, without commenting, no hands in pants. I know often that's what we see happening. But when we use a lot of the no's and the don'ts and the stops, it sometimes means we're not telling them what to do instead. And so it's just really important to clarify what is it that Kevin should be doing instead of what he's doing. And obviously just making sure that in this example with Kevin, that these strategies need to be folded into his school-based intervention plan, his behavior intervention plan, and making sure that everybody is applying these strategies with fidelity and using these strategies. And so in this topic, in this webinar, this is like some of the basics in terms of addressing sexuality education, trying to use some of the most common vignettes or common case examples that we see. And so I presented that first case example of Devin, a young child where we might not yet be thinking about it in terms of sexuality education, but really Devin needs a lot of skills addressed that relate to sexuality education. We have to teach and support him in understanding the rules that govern personal space, giving him ways to self-advocate around his sensory needs. He needs a way to be able to express and get those sensory needs met. For example, with Kevin, obviously, this is that example with Kevin is one we see a lot happening in community and clinical and school-based settings. And so the considerations there are to support him in being able to better understand and using visuals to help him understand where can private time happen, where and when, where are the places and spaces where it's safe and appropriate to do so. And of course, thinking about Kevin, giving Kevin better ways to self-advocate, to get his sensory needs met by being able to express the request for a break or for private time, so that he has ways to express those needs. And this last case example, before we get to question and answer, is a different case. This is Anna. Anna is a fairly independent 15-year-old girl with advanced verbal language who spends most of her day in the general education classroom. She has recently become very interested in having a boyfriend. At times, she makes unexpected and perhaps unwanted overtures to male peers at school. And she's also using social media platforms to try to get a boyfriend. At times, her texts and posts might be inappropriate. Some peers bully her by manipulating her to use sexual slang in the classroom, even though she does not always understand the meaning. So despite Anna's skills in many areas, she's naive to the complex rules and codes that govern how one should behave. So this is a very different example, but this is one we see a lot. And I'm sure maybe some of you can identify with this. So Anna is quite sophisticated in many ways, of course, but she's also naive to some of the nuances of social interaction. And this, of course, is consistent with what we see in some with autism. And sometimes her peers are manipulating her or kind of getting her into trouble by kind of coaxing her into using certain words in the classroom. And so since she wants to have a boyfriend, which was obviously like many other 15-year-old girls do as well, she doesn't know how to go about doing that in a way that's as safe and as appropriate. So we need to think about those core features of Anna's autism that inform how we're going to respond here. And again, it goes back to the idea of being concrete, being explicit and clear, and using visuals. Even though Anna has lots of language and is sophisticated, she still needs us to be very concrete and clear as we're supporting her in understanding some of the rules and the nuances. So what are some of the prerequisites for Anna that Anna needs maybe for us to support her in understanding that might lead towards healthy, happy, safe relationships for Anna? A few of the skills, if you want to call them skills or concepts: saying no. When is it okay to say no to a peer or an authority figure? Helping Anna to understand that she has the right to say no, and that there are many situations in which she should be empowered to say no. And so again, this goes back to self-advocacy. Sometimes we see that some individuals with autism don't have those self-advocacy skills. And so it's critical that we think about supporting Anna in understanding that it's okay to say no, and when and where should she, and helping her to discern that. Another key concept that Anna may need support in understanding is that her body is her own. It's hers, and she gets to decide the rest, right? Who is a friend? Who is not a friend? Helping Anna to recognize, for example, since she's being manipulated in the school setting by others, how can she start to recognize the signs that will tell her who's being a friend and who isn't? How does she know if somebody cares about me? What are some of the explicit rules that might help her to understand the behavior of others and whether they're showing caring and genuine caring and concern, or whether they're maybe manipulating her? And another key concept that's important to support Anna around is in helping her to see the perspective of other people. What do other people think if she does or says or posts certain things? And so how do we get at some of these prerequisite skills? There's a lot of strategies that we can use, and I'm going to show you some examples. Role playing is an important strategy. Role play. So this is one where we might be kind of designing some scenarios for Anna and talking her through and guiding her through being able to break these situations down and helping to teach her. So this is one example. Number one, a boy from her class tells you that his friend wants to be your boyfriend. He wants to kiss you. This boy tells you to walk over to the basketball court and go get your kiss. So Anna, what do you do? What do you say? This is where I might sit down with Anna and list visually out with her the things that this boy might be thinking. And then have Anna list the things that she's thinking and help Anna to see that what this boy is thinking might not match what Anna is thinking. Helping Anna to start to understand that sometimes people might display certain behaviors that don't actually match what they're thinking or what their intentions are. And that's a critical perspective taking or point of view concept that we want to help Anna to understand. Or another example, role play. You've texted your friend 2 times and it's been 2 days and there's no response. What is he thinking and feeling? Are you sure? How do you know? And so helping Anna to understand what are some of the rules that might tell her maybe this person doesn't want to interact with her, and just helping her to see and understand the perspective of other people in some of these situations. So role playing and using scenarios where we are sitting down and visually guiding her in understanding the perspective of other people can be a helpful instructional tool for some people with autism. And of course, I want to say this too. These strategies aren't just for people with autism. I have a 13-year-old, a naive 13-year-old son myself who needs a lot of support in understanding these rules as well. So other strategies we can use to help somebody like Anna is maybe playing social detective, where we're analyzing through role play and acting things out, or even analyzing still photos or videos where the sound is turned off to help Anna to start to see what and be a social detective and to recognize what other people might be thinking or feeling in a given situation. So these are just a few examples where we're sitting down and using these kinds of photos with Anna to help talk her through and help her to identify, what is this young man in this first picture thinking or feeling? What are these 2 girls in this other photo where they're whispering to each other? What might they be thinking or feeling about this girl in pink? What might they be saying? Is it likely that what they're saying is kind? Are they being friends to her or are they not? Helping Anna to recognize and decipher some of those cues and signs, the nonverbal behaviors that govern how we interact socially. So helping her to be a social detective and to pay attention to the hidden clues and cues. That's a critical strategy that we often have to spend a lot of time on in supporting someone with autism in understanding. Defining the concrete rules to guide decision making for Anna. Who is a friend and who is not a friend? What behaviors are okay and what behaviors are not okay? And so again, verbally explaining all this to Anna is often not the way to go. We often need to use visual supports to help us, Anna, understand and to map this onto visuals. So, for example, with Anna, she's really into Star Wars. She loves things, all things Star Wars. So I might develop this little T chart, this little graphic organizer, where on the left-hand side, we're listing the topics that are, or the kinds of photos that are okay to show or to do in public. And what are the behaviors or photos or posts that are not okay to put out in public? So visually helping her to see what's okay, what's expected, and what's not okay, and what's not expected. There are a lot of resources and curricula out there along these lines that help teachers, help parents and family members, and even self-advocates, of course, that are geared towards self-advocates specifically, that can help some individuals to understand and delineate and map out these rules and behaviors. The incredible 5-point scale is one of those great resources. I'm just wanting to point you towards some of these tools. There are visual supports such as this one. This is a graphic organizer. This is intended to support Anna in understanding what are private behaviors, what are semi-private behaviors, what are semi-public behaviors, and what are fully public, what can happen in public. So for Anna, she can understand some of the nuances, of course. We can create more levels or layers, right? But we needed to delineate it in visual concrete form with her, in collaboration with her, where she's sitting down and we're filling this out together and helping her to see and understand some of these rules. So in private, these are the things that happen. And in semi-private settings, these are the things that happen. Helping her to understand those concepts about what's private and what's not. And another key strategy for Anna is going to be to help her understand what other people are thinking or feeling when she does certain things versus what she might assume that they are thinking or feeling. And so, for example, here's another quick visual. These don't have to be fancy, parents and professionals. You could use a piece of paper, draw a T-chart, for example, and then you maybe, in this case, I wrote, if I post this picture, and maybe we're using concrete examples of that Anna is showing me on her phone. This is a picture I want to post. And we're talking together about, is this picture appropriate to put on social media, for example? Here's what I wish other people might think about me. And so we're having Anna list out what she hopes people will think about her if she posts that photo. And then helping her to see, however, from other people's perspectives, here's what they might think about her if she posts that picture. So helping her to understand that whatever she's thinking and feeling may not match what other people perceive about her. So again, trying to get at those hidden rules, those hidden perspectives to help her to make safer, healthier decisions. Concretely and visually supporting this information for her. Some of the other key strategies for Anna in this particular case are she obviously needs a trusted adult who she can confide in and consult with. Somebody who can be just a listening ear, an interpreter for her, a social interpreter, someone who she trusts. And then maybe she might have a hard time verbalizing some of the hard questions that relate to sexuality education. So maybe she needs a safer way, a more comfortable way for her to communicate questions and to get answers. And so this is an example where actually in the classroom setting, we supported a particular individual who had a lot of questions, and his parents were having a hard time because he didn't want to ask those questions. And so he started to use a safe journal to ask questions of his parents, and then they were able to respond in writing to him. And that just felt more comfortable to him. He was able to ask some of those questions by writing them down rather than having to verbalize some of those questions. Just giving the individual an outlet, a way to express questions and to get some of those issues addressed. And so for Anna too, other topics that we're probably going to have to address with her, teaching routines, teaching sequences, what to do when these things happen. So for example, what do I do if my period comes unexpectedly? Who do I tell if my own private body part is touched or shown by someone else? Who's my safe person that I need to go to? What do I do if I receive a strange or sexy message or post or picture? What do I do if I'm asked to send a strange or sexy message, post, or picture? So for Anna, we need to be proactive in helping her to know what to do when these things occur. Because for particularly around the issue of text messages that are strange or unusual or unexpected, we should expect those things to happen, as it does for many teenagers. And so helping her to understand what to do if those things occur. Who is her safe person to go to? How should she respond? If she gets a strange or sexy message, what should be her next thing that she does? And writing out that plan for her of what she's going to do or who she's going to consult with or tell. Those are really important proactive safety strategies to have in place for her. And then practicing and rehearsing that with her. It's something I've had to do with my own 13-year-old son again, helping him to understand if you get a message like this or you get something from somebody you don't know, here's what you need to do, and writing that out so it's very clear. So, I know I'm just skimming the surface here. I know that there are a lot of things I didn't address in this introductory, fairly quick webinar that's just touching the topics of sexuality education at a very surface level. But at the end of the day, I'm hopeful that what you're seeing are a few key things to keep in mind is to be proactive and try to start early wherever you can. And by being proactive, what I mean is addressing the issue or topic or concept using concrete, clear, positively framed information done in a way that's presented in segments in a way that the individual will understand it, and using visuals to support our instruction, using visuals to support our explanations wherever we can. Because across the autism spectrum, visual supports are relevant. And that's what I tried to show you here too, is visual supports aren't just schedules and pictures. Visual supports also are what I was showing you for Anna. Visual scales, graphic organizers, worksheets that help her to be able to map and discern and decide what's okay and what's not okay, or what's healthy and what's not healthy. And then fundamental to all of this is finding the ways to change our own communication in order to support their understanding of this information.